January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippine Islands. The rain falls in sheets across the muddy compounds of Santo Tomas Internment Camp, drumming against corrugated metal roofs with a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of captivity. In a makeshift medical tent lit by kerosene lamps, a U.S. Army medic named Private Thomas Harrington wipes his hands on a cloth stained with iodine and blood. He is 23 years old. He has been trained to stop bleeding, to set bones, to extract shrapnel from the bodies of men who scream in languages he does not understand. He has not been trained for this. Before him, lying on a cot made from salvaged wood and threadbare blankets, is a young Japanese woman. Her name is Akiko. She is 19. Her face is pale, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Her hands clutch the edges of the cot as another contraction seizes her body. Outside, the liberation of Manila is underway. The 6th Army advances through streets choked with rubble and fire. But here, in this tent that smells of disinfectant and rain-soaked earth, the war has narrowed to a single fragile moment: the delivery of a child whose mother is the enemy, and whose life will begin in the hands of those she was taught to fear. This is not a story the propaganda films prepared anyone for. This is not a moment that fits neatly into narratives of victory and defeat. This is a collision of ideology and humanity, played out in blood and breath, and the first cry of a newborn who knows nothing of empires or flags. The Pacific War, by January 1945, had become a crucible of atrocity and endurance. For 3.5 years, the Empire of Japan and the United States had waged a conflict defined by its brutality, a war not merely of territory, but of total annihilation. The Japanese military code, rooted in Bushido and the imperial rescript of soldiers and sailors, demanded absolute loyalty unto death. Surrender was disgrace. Capture was unthinkable. To be taken alive was to cease being human in the eyes of one's own nation. And yet, by the winter of 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese civilians found themselves in precisely that unthinkable position. As American forces liberated the Philippines, they encountered not only military prisoners, but also waves of displaced Japanese nationals, merchants, nurses, teachers, colonial administrators, and their families, who had been swept into the archipelago during Japan's imperial expansion. Among them were women, pregnant women, women whose husbands had died in combat, or disappeared into the jungle, or been executed as war criminals, women who now faced childbirth in enemy custody, a fate they had been conditioned to believe would end in torture, humiliation, or death. The American soldiers and medics who encountered these women carried their own conditioning. For years, they had been told that the Japanese were fanatical, subhuman, incapable of reason or mercy. They had seen the aftermath of the Bataan Death March. They had buried friends killed by kamikaze pilots. They had read letters from home describing brothers and cousins who would never return from Guadalcanal or Saipan. The enemy was not supposed to be vulnerable. The enemy was not supposed to be afraid. The enemy was certainly not supposed to be in labor. Private Harrington had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner and a schoolteacher. He had learned basic field medicine in a crash course at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where instructors drilled into the essentials: stop the bleeding, prevent infection, stabilize, and evacuate. He had practiced on dummies and livestock. He had never delivered a baby. When his unit, part of the 37th Infantry Division, rolled into the outskirts of Manila in early January, the chaos was absolute. The city was a labyrinth of destroyed buildings, desperate civilians, and Japanese holdouts who fought to death from every corner. It was during the sweep of Santo Tomas that Harrington first encountered the Japanese women. The camp had been established by the Japanese military to intern Allied civilians, Americans, Britons, Australians, who had been trapped in the Philippines after Pearl Harbor. But in the final chaotic weeks before liberation, the camp's population had swelled with Japanese nationals fleeing the American advance. When the gates were thrown open, the liberators found a surreal tableau: emaciated Allied prisoners embracing their rescuers, and Japanese families huddled in the far corner of the compound, silent and terrified. Among them was Akiko. She was 8 months pregnant. Her husband had been a low-level administrative clerk in the occupation government. He had been killed 3 weeks earlier during an American air raid. She had nowhere to go. When the camp was liberated, She assumed she would be shot. That was what she had been told would happen. That was what Japanese radio broadcasts had promised. American soldiers were savages who raped and murdered without mercy. When the GIs approached, she closed her eyes and waited for the end. Instead, she was given water, a blanket, a tin of Spam. The moment when Harrington was called to the medical tent, he experienced a dissonance so profound it felt like vertigo. He had been carrying the weight of his own grief. His best friend, Danny Kowalski, had been killed by a sniper just 6 days earlier, and he had nurtured a quiet, burning hatred for the enemy ever since. But now, standing over this young woman whose body was racked with labor pains, he found that hatred collapsing into something more complicated. She was the enemy. She was also someone's daughter. She was also dying. The Japanese women in the camp were malnourished, many suffering from beriberi, dysentery, and infections. Medical supplies were scarce. Harrington had morphine, sulfa powder, some bandages, and his training. He had no obstetrician, no anesthesia, no surgical instruments beyond a basic field kit. He looked at Akiko and saw not the propagandized face of the enemy, but a terrified teenager whose water had broken and whose baby was breech. He did not speak Japanese. She did not speak English. But in that tent, language became irrelevant. He gestured for her to breathe. He held her hand. He positioned her as best he could and, with trembling fingers, tried to remember everything he had ever read about childbirth. The baby was stuck. He could feel the tiny feet. Akiko's pulse was weakening. She was hemorrhaging. If he did nothing, she would die. The baby would die. He could walk away. No one would question it. She was the enemy. He stayed. For 4 hours, Harrington worked. He was assisted by a Filipino nurse named Maria, who had survived the occupation and spoke fragments of Japanese. Together, they coaxed the baby into position. Harrington's hands, which had been trained to destroy, now worked to create. He felt the infant's fragile limbs, the impossibly delicate skull. He guided the child free, inch by inch, while Akiko screamed and wept and gasped for air that seemed too thin to sustain life. And then at 11:47 p.m., the baby emerged. A girl, silent at first, blue and slick with fluid. Harrington cleared her airway, rubbed her chest, breathed gently into her mouth. And then she cried. The sound was thin and reedy, but it filled the tent like a cathedral bell. Akiko wept. Harrington wept. Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Tagalog. The baby lived. Against all odds, against the machinery of war and the weight of history, she lived. This moment, this single unremarkable act of mercy, was repeated dozens of times in the weeks that followed. As American forces secured Manila and the surrounding provinces, they encountered more pregnant Japanese women, more desperate mothers clinging to infants born in ditches and basements and abandoned school buildings. The official policy was ambiguous. Japanese nationals were being interned as prisoners of war, but there were no clear guidelines for handling civilian births. Some commanders viewed the women as security risks. Others saw them as victims of their own government's propaganda. The medics, however, did not operate on policy. They operated on instinct. Men like Harrington, who had been trained to see the enemy as monolithic and monstrous, found themselves face to face with the irreducible humanity of childbirth. They delivered babies in field hospitals and bombed out churches. They scrounged for clean water and sterilized their instruments over open flames. They used parachute silk for swaddling cloths and melted chocolate bars to provide calories to starving mothers. The symbolic object that recurred in these moments was not a weapon or a flag, but a simple ration tin. The K-ration, standard issue for American troops, contained crackers, canned meat, powdered coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. To a starving Japanese civilian, it represented abundance almost incomprehensible. Many of the women had not seen white sugar in years. The Japanese home front, by 1945, was surviving on sawdust bread and acorn paste. The imperial government had promised that Japan's empire would bring prosperity. Instead, it had brought famine. When Harrington handed Akiko a K-ration after birth, she stared at it as if it were a hallucination. She opened the tin with shaking hands and ate slowly, tears streaming down her face. She had been told that Americans were demons. She had been told that capture meant death. Instead, she had been given food. Her baby had been saved. The cognitive dissonance was total. The transformation that occurred in those weeks was not limited to the Japanese women. The American medics, too, were changed. They had entered the war as boys shaped by propaganda, convinced of their moral superiority and the justice of their cause. They were not wrong. There was justice in defeating fascism, in liberating death camps and occupied nations. But war is never only one thing. It is also the grunt hauling a wounded enemy soldier to safety because he cannot bear to let another human being bleed out in the mud. It is the medic who delivers the enemy's child and then rocks that child asleep while the mother recovers. Harrington wrote a letter home to his mother in March 1945. In it, he described the birth of Akiko's daughter. He wrote, "I don't know what this means, Ma. I thought I knew who the enemy was. I thought it was simple. But when I held that baby, I kept thinking about how she didn't choose this. None of them did. Maybe none of us did. I don't know if that makes me weak or just tired. But I know I couldn't let her die. I couldn't." His mother saved the letter. It was found among her possessions after her death in 1983, yellowed and fragile, a testament to a moment when the machinery of war ground to a halt in the face of something older and more fundamental. The Japanese government, through its network of propaganda, had spent years constructing an image of American soldiers as barbaric, racially inferior, and morally degenerate. This was necessary to justify the war, to maintain morale, to convince Japanese citizens that death was preferable to capture. But propaganda is a fragile edifice, and it cannot survive contact with lived experience. When the women interned in the Philippines began to share their stories of medics who delivered their babies, of soldiers who gave them food and medicine, of captivity that did not involve rape or execution, the narrative began to crack. After the war, many of these women returned to Japan. Some were shunned for having been captured alive, for having collaborated with the enemy by accepting help. Others spoke quietly to their families about what they had witnessed. Akiko, who survived the war and raised her daughter in a small town outside Osaka, never forgot the young American medic who saved their lives. She kept a photograph taken by a Signal Corps photographer in March 1945, showing Harrington holding her daughter. The baby is wrapped in a parachute silk blanket. Harrington is smiling, exhausted, his uniform stained and rumpled. It is an image of improbable tenderness. In 1972, Akiko wrote a letter to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, trying to locate Harrington. She wanted to thank him. She wanted him to know that her daughter had grown up, married, had children of her own. She wanted him to know that his mercy had echoed forward through generations. The letter was never answered. Harrington had died in a car accident in 1968, but the letter exists archived in a file in Washington, a small monument to the persistence of gratitude. The epilogue of the story is not about victory or defeat. It is about the stubborn, irrational persistence of human decency in conditions designed to extinguish it. The war in the Pacific was brutal beyond measure. It was a war of firebombing and starvation, of kamikaze pilots and atomic weapons, of atrocities committed by all sides in name of survival and ideology. And yet, within that vast machinery of death, there were moments, small, fragile, easily overlooked, when the machinery stopped. When a medic chose mercy over hatred. When a mother who expected death received life instead. When a baby born into the furnace of war was given a chance to grow old. The symbol that persists is the ration tin. It appears in dozens of accounts from the Pacific Theater, given to starving civilians, shared with enemy soldiers, used as a measure of the vast material superiority that American abundance represented. But it was never just about material wealth. It was about what that abundance signified. A society that could afford mercy, that could extend compassion even to those it was fighting, that understood freedom not merely as the absence of oppression, but as the presence of possibility. The Japanese women who gave birth in American custody in 1945 had been raised in a system that valorized sacrifice, obedience, and death before dishonor. They had been told that their worth was measured by their loyalty to the emperor, that individual life was insignificant compared to the collective glory of a nation. And then they were captured, and they were not killed. They were fed. Their babies were delivered by enemy soldiers who stayed up all night to keep them alive. The ideological foundation of their world collapsed, not because of speeches or manifestos, but because of acts of simple, unremarkable kindness. April 1945. Manila, Philippines. The war is not over, but it is ending. The city is a graveyard of shattered buildings and burned-out tanks. In a field hospital near the docks, Akiko cradles her daughter and watches as American ships arrive with more supplies, more medicine, more food. She does not understand how a nation at war can be so abundant. She does not understand how the men who bomb her city can also be the men who save her life. But she understands this. Her daughter will grow up. She will learn to walk, to speak, to dream. She will know a world beyond this tent, this war, this moment of suspended horror. And that, Akiko realizes, is the victory that matters. Not the victory of flags or territory, but the victory of one fragile life, continuing against all odds. Private Harrington packs his medical kit. He has delivered 17 babies in the past 2 months. He has lost count of the wounds he has dressed, the limbs he has splinted, the men he has watched die. He is tired. He is 23 years old, and he feels ancient. But when he looks at the rows of makeshift cribs, at the tiny faces swaddled in parachute silk, he feels something else. Hope, maybe, or just a stubborn, defiant belief that the world can still surprise you, that even in the midst of hell, you can deliver new life, that even when every instinct screams for vengeance, you can choose mercy. He does not know what kind of world these children will inherit. He does not know if the peace will hold, if the hatreds will fade, if the lessons will be learned. He only knows that he did what he could. He held the line between death and life, and he chose life. That, in the end, is the only ideology that survives a war. 70 years later, in a small apartment in Osaka, an old woman named Akiko sits with her granddaughter and shows her a photograph. In the picture, a young American soldier holds a newborn baby. The soldier is smiling. The baby is sleeping. "This is how you came to be," Akiko says softly. "This is how we survived." The granddaughter looks at the photograph and asks, "What was his name?" Akiko shakes her head. "I never knew, but I remember his hands. They were gentle." And in that memory, preserved across decades and oceans, is the stubborn, quiet truth that no propaganda can erase. That mercy once given echoes forward forever. That the choice to save a life, even the life of an enemy, is the choice that defines us. That in the darkest chapters of history, it is not the grand gestures that redeem us, but the small ones. The hand that wipes a brow, the rations shared, the baby delivered into a world at war, and given the chance to live in a world at peace. This is a lesson written not in treaties or textbooks, but in blood and breath and the first cry of a child who should not have survived. This is a lesson that endures.